Well, good morning again.
Good morning.
Great to see you for our daily devotion. I'm going to ask Jen if she could read from John 20. Thanks, Jen.
Sure. Beginning at verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying.
Thanks, Jen. Well, let's start with a quiz. What are the following phobias? Claustrophobia, arachnophobia, hemophobia, dentophobia, ablutophobia, and acrophobia. The answers, in case you didn't know, are the fear of confined spaces, spiders, blood, dentists, washing, and heights. There are many, many other named phobias. We live in a world of fear. I wonder what makes you afraid? What makes you panic? It's panic we meet at the beginning of John's account of the resurrection. There's a lot of running about. Mary is running in panic in verse 2, and then Peter and John run in verse 4. As would you if you thought someone was desecrating the remains of a loved one. Imagine you went to visit the grave of a recently deceased relative and found it had been dug up. You might well run for help as Mary did, or run to the grave as Peter and John did. Grave robbing was a big issue at the time. A few years later, Emperor Claudius had to make it a capital offence in an attempt to stamp it out. So they run, expecting the grave to have been desecrated. And what do they find? Order. The emphasis on running is replaced by an emphasis on the grave clothes. Verse 5 says John looked in at the strips of linen lying in there. We get almost the same phrase in verse 6, except it's Peter's turn to see the strips of linen lying there. Then verse 7 describes the headcloth in great detail. John is telling a big story in a few words, and yet he makes time to give us this detail on linen. If you're burgling a house, you don't tidy up after yourself, you're in a hurry. You grab and run. And if you were robbing a grave or moving a body, then you would keep the grave clothes on. You would make it life easier and less smelly. And we're talking about yards of cloth wrapped around the body with spices between the layers. And that's the point. These grave clothes are not even ripped off. The language used suggests they were folded in an orderly fashion. Imagine the scene from Peter's perspective. Mary runs from the tomb in a panic. It takes a while to catch what she's saying, but eventually you work out that the body of Jesus is missing. And then you too panic. Then you too run. 1,000 thoughts flood your mind. Is it robbers? Is it too late? Could you confront them? Or is it the religious leaders? Could you get the Romans involved? What if they're already involved? What if they've sanctioned this? Ahead of you, John looks in but does nothing. Is someone inside? Are they armed? Or is he repulsed by desecration? And so you arrive, flustered, sweaty, breathless. You burst in, ready for action, and what do you find? A neat stack of laundry. No violence, no chaos, no confusion, just a pile of linen. The disciples run to the rescue and find everything under control. In fact, in verse 10, they just go back home. There's nothing for them to do. Everything is under control. What makes you rush around in panic? Think about what it is that fills you with fear, and then in your head play out your worst case scenario. What does it look like? Ultimately, our worst fears end in death. Health and safety, our despair about aging, our fear of losing relationships, these are all reflections of our underlying fear of death. But if there is life beyond death, then we have no reason to be afraid. There is no need to panic. Everything is under control. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.